Thank you to Patrice, Shannon, John, and Matt for those remarks and sharing your insights. I am Diana. I am the communication strategist for the Carbon Action Alliance, and I'd like to welcome you to our next panel, Understanding Public Sentiment Toward Carbon Management, Understanding Public Awareness of Carbon Management Technology Across the Country, Common Questions and Concerns, and what different regions and communities want from the energy transition have been key priorities in our work. And the build-out of carbon management and other clean energy projects will affect every individual in the country at some point in one way or another. So that's why we want to broaden the bench of stakeholders involved in carbon management, welcoming new faces, professions, and industries into the field. We want people to be at the center of the carbon management deployment with environmental justice and worker and community benefits at the forefront. With that, I'm excited to welcome the panelists who each have an extensive background on working with environmental issues as well as engagement with the communities that they are a part of and across the country. So I would like to introduce Ben Finzel, Vernice Miller-Travis, Lori Weigel, and our moderator, Nate Morris.
Good morning again, and just shout out to the AV team who's doing such a good job rolling with us as we figure out these mic switches. I appreciate y'all. Good morning again. I have no games or prizes for y'all today, but the real prize is this phenomenal panel that we get to hear from and learn from. I'm very excited about this conversation with Lori and with Vernice and with Ben. They will have the opportunity to introduce themselves in just a bit, but they are doing some phenomenal work across a wide range of community engagement and community understanding, and so excited to bring this to you all today. And genuinely excited because of how important this topic is. As we have talked about over the course of the last day and a half, there are a number of different things that I think have been recurring points that we've heard, right? The undeniable importance, number one, of engaging with communities in a real and authentic way. Two, the undeniable importance of ensuring that we deeply understand how environmental injustices and environmental racism have perpetuated the injustices and the inequities that we see today and have caused community distrust, and how that places us in an important moment to reconcile with that reality while we move forward with engaging with communities. And three, the unique and critical inflection point that we're in with both the amount of work that is happening and with the unparalleled number of resources that exist for us to really make a unique and powerful change. And I'm reminded of a question that Vernice posed while we were doing prep for this over the last few weeks. She asked, what are we going to do differently this time, right? We have all of this knowledge, we have all of this information, and we have all of these resources. And so in order to get it right, we can't do the same thing over and over again. And so I'm grateful that this esteemed panel will provide us with some insight around how to understand what communities' perspectives are, but also how to do so in a really critical and in a really authentic way from a variety of different standpoints and levels. So we're going to work on building on that question and building on the work that we have done so far. And when we talk about understanding communities, it doesn't just mean educating or convincing or setting aside different viewpoints, right? As Arcelia said yesterday, which I really appreciated, it means putting in the work to really know a community's concerns, understand those root causes, and engage in a two-way dialogue with communities as partners. So to walk through this, we've got these brilliant group of folks, and we're going to take us from a 30,000-foot view to a ground-level view to get as much of this perspective as we can. And I promise you that I have set aside as much time as possible for you all to be able to ask your questions after I ask one. So let's start with that 30,000-foot view. We are going to hear from Lori Weigel, who's going to walk us through her findings. She's done some incredible opinion research, and she's going to walk us through the data that she's learned when it comes to community perspectives around carbon management at this point. So I'm going to invite Lori up. If you would like to sit, I can bring you the clicker, or if you would like to join the podium.
Well, they have me mic'd now, so I don't want to make a lot of...
I think they can switch it if you wanted to, yeah.
Okay.
But let me not complicate it for y'all in the back. I apologize for just...
We're good?
You're good, okay.
If I come up here? Okay, all right. Attach. Ooh, he's tall. Okay, there we go. All right, so I think they're gonna pull up some slides for me. So hi, everyone. Good morning. So I already know that you all are incredibly different from the people that we do research with because it's a gorgeous fall day. It's beautiful outside, and you guys have chosen to be in this somewhat dimly lit conference room, right? So already, besides hearing about NOx and SOx and stuff that I probably failed in chemistry in high school, I already know this group is different, and so learning to communicate with people that, like me, didn't do so well in chemistry class is really important. So I want to talk a little bit about what we have done, and it's not moving. Is this the right clicker? Sorry. Maybe this is the clicker? That's the clicker. There we go. All right. So technologically, and it won't go back now, but that's all right. So here's what we have done. We have done a lot of research. There, it went back. Thank you. And I'll talk about the reasons behind why we do research in just a second. But basically, we have looked at a number of different states from Louisiana, Iowa, Colorado, Pennsylvania, Oklahoma, into specific communities where we sat down and had conversations with people, and then using technology as well to have in-depth conversations over a period of multiple days with respondents in a number of different states. We also have talked to groups that are very focused on environmental activity, and therefore I'm just going to loosely call them environmentalists, although they may not work in that field. They donate or contribute to those types of organizations, and to see if there was any distinctions behind what they do, behind how they feel about some of these issues, which in fact there were. But why do we do research? Well, when my kids were little and I would go and moderate focus groups, they would say, "What do you do again?" I say, "I listen to people." That's the first step. It's probably the first step for lots of people in terms of the process of going into a community as well, but we really start by having these more open-ended conversations where we are interacting with folks, listening to them, hearing their reactions to a number of things. It really reveals the why behind a lot of opinions, and it helps to better understand how do we frame and communicate in a way that is not going to be off-putting. And then, like a scientist might, we test those hypotheses in random sample, statistically significant surveys. And that really provides the who, how much, like, the quantitative data that we're focused on. And it helps us to target our communications. I'm going to stay at the 30,000-foot level today, but certainly there's times when a more specific messaging is required. So what have we found out? Well, this is sort of the look that we got in our focus groups. It epitomizes, even in places where projects had been proposed, most people had heard next to nothing about any sort of carbon capture, carbon management, whatever we want to call it, which we'll talk about in a second. Most had heard almost nothing about that. So we're starting with a blank slate in many cases. And in fact, that extends to even what is carbon dioxide. We've had people confused with carbon monoxide. Oh, is that why I have this little gizmo in my house? So we're starting at a very, very initial place here. And even in one of our very first conversations, we asked people, okay, why would we want to reduce the amount of carbon dioxide? Some people connected it to climate change. I don't know. I always hear about the ozone whenever I talk about any sort of air quality issues at all. But, it was kind of all over the place. And some, frankly, just said, I have no idea why we would do that. Now, because people are starting from a very initial space where they just have absolutely no idea what we're talking about, they have lots and lots of questions about this. You're going to notice a theme. This is just sort of collectively across lots of qualitative research, what we've heard. But these questions have a lot to do with how safe is it, essentially, who's keeping track that it's going to be safe, and then why do we do this? Like, why is this the best option or preferable option or good option? And then who's backing this, right? Who's behind this? People are incredibly cynical and skeptical these days, so that's important. So we have worked hard, and we have, tailored this in different communities. You're going to see at one point where it says, insert what is appropriate for this project. But basically, we have to start by saying, hey, there's this gas that we breathe out every day, right? Just baseline here. But it's also produced by vehicles and burning fossil fuels for electricity, or the process of producing things that we use every day, right? Like cement or steel or ethanol. And then rather than allowing this to be released out into the air, where it can contribute to climate change, depending on the community, I might stress that or not, we can remove it and pump it down over a mile underground. I love some of the materials that I've seen here, where it's like really sort of, reinforcing just how far that is. We also need to say it's away from groundwater. And then we have to talk about after storage, the well is sealed and long-term monitoring continues. I didn't even know it was possible to do that from satellites, but that's cool. So anyway, so we have to start with some really basic information, and this has tended to resonate and be helpful and sort of level set everything that we go through. Now, there can be changes, community, but these are the general dynamics we have seen on carbon capture. Honestly, these are the general dynamics we see if we talk about climate change. And you'll see, for example, in Louisiana, when we asked them about particular projects and support or oppose for that, the people that believed in human-caused climate change were far more supportive of taking these actions than those who were somewhat skeptical or felt it was due to natural causes or just simply that it wasn't happening. So there's a dynamic there. Now, what do we call this? So a lot of times I spend a lot of time talking to people about words and language and what their reaction is. Well, guess what? Capture, what do I capture? I capture something dangerous usually. Like when you hear someone's captured, it's usually like a criminal on the loose, right? Or it's like a lion or tiger or bear, oh my. So it is, it's something that's sort of scary, right? So just that word capture was kind of off-putting to a lot of people. So if we're managing something, that's so much calmer, right? All of a sudden I'm not scared anymore. Or when we're reusing, which we've definitely seen this idea of reuse and return or recycling, that whole concept people love in the abstract, definitely. And this is way too small for you guys to see. But basically, we've had where we can demonstrate a track record of success and that there's oversight of operations has been incredibly compelling, right? They need to have some specifics. They need to say that there's, especially if someone's going over and above what the law requires in terms of extra safety precautions, that's something that resonates incredibly strongly. It was already mentioned on the last panel, but for example, in Louisiana, we've seen that those reducing co-pollutants, see, I'm changing my language. Reducing co-pollutants was something that was just immediately impactful. People were like, okay, we know we've got this long history, this is a problem, and therefore, and I will note in this language, when we talk, it's not really that we're talking about nitrogen dioxide or whatever, it's that these have been linked to lung disease, cancer, a shortened lifespan, according to the American Lung Association, which everyone trusts is sort of a neutral third party. That has been incredibly impactful. And people really felt like, from an environmental justice impact, when we sat down with folks in Baton Rouge, that this idea that we are finally doing something to address a problem that has been well recognized was it just resonated in an entirely, honestly, surprising way from what we thought we might encounter. I have like 10 seconds left, but here's just a few things that have varied wildly in terms of response. Sometimes we've seen, if we talk about, well, this is the equivalent of taking this many cars off the road. I will say we've had a few problems sometimes. People literally thought we were taking cars off the road. It's like, no, that's not what we're doing. They're not going to vanish and you won't have to sit in traffic anymore. But in some places that analogy worked well. The idea that this is the only feasible technology to continue to produce a needed product can be helpful, but I will say in Iowa, people thought there's no way you're gonna ethanol's too big, it's too important. How in the world would you possibly impact ethanol, right? They're here to stay. Again, this idea that this is not some new thing, we're not the guinea pigs that you're dealing with, was important. And then obviously, if we solely focus on climate change, we're gonna get a very, very partisan response. Messengers, you already know to use trusted messengers. That can vary depending on what we're dealing with. In Iowa, where we were talking about more about pipelines, people were solely focused on safety and therefore emergency response folks, like firefighters, was important. Criticisms do have a big impact, and the most damaging really are these three. We have not found a successful way to talk ourselves around and out of eminent domain. That simply is a big concern, and I'm going to skip to this. Within the environmentally conscious voters that we spoke to, and we had a good group within that audience that was more environmentally justice focused as well. But the things that we have seen that resonated most was stressing that carbon management needs to be a part of the transition, right? Or evolution, as someone talked about yesterday. Focusing on industrial manufacturing, because people want to keep manufacturing in the United States. That was important. And then with this audience, staying away from connections to oil and gas companies as much as possible was very important. I overextended my time, so I apologize. But that was it, talking as fast as I can. All right. Woo.
Thank you, Lori. There we go. Wow. I very much appreciate that. And we know, right, that looking at things at this high level is important, and it's also one piece of the puzzle. And so I want to ensure that we're also bringing it down to the ground level, and I'm grateful to have Ben and Vernice here who are doing that work in different ways in terms of engaging in communication. And so I want to ensure that y'all's voices are brought immediately into this conversation as well, and give you the chance before I have a few questions for all of y'all just to introduce yourselves as well.
Introduce.
Yeah.
I'm Vernice Millie-Travis. I'm Executive Vice President at Metropolitan Group, a social change agency and strategic communications firm. We're based in Portland, Oregon, but I am based in the DC office, and I lead our environmental justice and social justice practice areas, and I've been in the environmental justice field for 38 years. I know I don't look it, but just trust me on this.
Also from DC, Ben Finzel, president of RENEWPR. We are a communications consulting firm in Washington, DC. We work on energy, environment, and equity. And I have been working in the energy and environment space since 1990. I started when I was 12. No, I'm kidding, I wasn't 12. And I also have the pleasure of working with GPI on the Carbon Capture Coalition, among other things. So great to see this research and great to get a chance to talk about it.
Thank you all so much. Or if you introduce yourself.
Yeah, I kind of jumped right in, didn't I? So I'm Lori Weigel. I'm the principal of Newbridge Strategy. I'm in the Denver area. Previously was in DC many moons ago, and I work on lots of public policy issues, but many in the environmental and energy space. And as you saw, we try and translate really complex public policy conundrums into plainer language so we can all communicate better.
Thank you. And so I want to jump right into, I have one question for each of you all individually. But yesterday, Alejandro, when he was leading his panel, I think said something that really stood out to me, which was that there are stories behind the statistics, right? And so we can look at numbers, but there are individual people and individual lives behind each of those different numbers. And so Vernice, I know that so much of your work is centered around deeply connecting with those stories and elevating the voices of communities across this country. And so I would love to hear from you what perspectives you're hearing from community members around carbon management right now, and what are the gaps, the things that we are missing often when we are doing this outreach and engagement that we can work to correct.
Sure. So good morning, everyone, and thank you to GPI for inviting me to be a part of this conversation. I have learned so much over the last day and a half, so very much. And so thank you to all of you who have spoken, and the sidebar conversations we've had. I've really learned a great deal, and I hope that you will, that the learning will be two-way. So the first thing I want to offer up is that I've heard a thread coming through some of the presentations and some of the panels that, and even our panel so far this morning, that if we communicate more effectively, that we will raise the level of acceptability of carbon capture. And what is perhaps the biggest problem is that people just don't understand the technology. But if they understand, they would be more accepting. And I just need to disabuse you of that knowledge. That is absolutely, fundamentally, patently untrue. It is absolutely untrue. It's especially untrue in environmental justice communities because people really understand the technology. Why do they understand the technology? Because they've lived with it for so very long. They may not live with carbon capture, but they've lived with every other kind of, particularly related to energy production, extraction, transport, disposal. Every part of the energy cycle they have lived with because they live in the places that are adjacent to or closest to where that energy is being produced, for the most part, right? So they've had to learn a lot. I'm a perfect example of that. I didn't live near energy facilities. I lived near and grew up near a giant sewage treatment plant in New York City. A sewage treatment plant that was built to treat 180 million gallons of raw sewage per day from the entire west side of Manhattan to help improve the quality of the water of the Hudson River, our beloved Hudson River. But it was built with no odor control devices. So everyone who lived immediately adjacent to the plant, 100,000 people in Upper Manhattan, Harlem, Washington Heights, were plagued with the smell of raw sewage on a daily basis, 180 million gallons. It was god-awful. It changed our lives. It changed our lives. So what did we do? We had to learn about a sewage treatment plant. I knew as much as any stationary engineer about how a sewage treatment plant works, what the problems were, and how to fix it. I did not study science. I did not go to school to be a stationary engineer. I studied political science. I was on my way to law school. None of this was part of my orientation. But I had to learn it in order to understand what the problems are, how to communicate to the community at large what was going on, and how to communicate to the regulators how to fix the problem. It took us 8 years and litigation to get the city of New York and the state of New York to fix the problem, but fix the problem they did to the tune of $55 million. But it never should have been built without any odor control devices. I tell you that example simply to say that people learn what they need to learn, particularly when it has direct impact on their lives and the lives of their loved ones. You learn and you raise expectations. You raise the expectations of local government and the regulators. Everyone needs to come into this conversation knowing as much as they can possibly know and being able to communicate that as clearly as possible. People are not undereducated. People know this conversation. And it's not the message, it's not the messenger. They don't like what you're selling because they're already living in places that are environmentally overburdened. And you have lots of benefits that you can offer, and this is what they will tell you. That sounds great, particularly the reduction of particulate pollution, which is killing people at amazing levels in EJ communities. They will resonate with that, and this is what they will say to you. If it's such a great technology, why don't we put it where you live? And then why don't we work out the problems? Why don't we work out the technology till we get it really refined and we know it's working excellently? And then we can talk about bringing it to the places that are already overburdened with industrial sources of pollution. That seems like a perfectly rational response to me. It doesn't seem like a rational response to you because you don't live in the places that have the enormous burden of industrial facilities and pollution that they have had. Last thing I'll say about this, just today, I'm the kind of person that I start my day reading the news. So I'm from New York, I live in DC. My two local newspapers are the New York Times and the Washington Post. I read them every day. Before I brush my teeth, I read the paper, right? And there's a story in the Washington Post today, an epidemic of chronic illness is killing Americans in their prime. US life expectancy is rapidly declining. A year-long study from the Washington Post indicated that chronic diseases are the greatest threat, killing far more people between the ages of 35 to 64, according to mortality data. Dying prematurely has become the most telling measure of the nation's growing inequality. I could have told them that. I don't know how much money they spent on this study, but we already had that data from northern Manhattan, that we had the highest rate of premature death from asthma and respiratory disease of any community in the Western Hemisphere. We did that data with the Mailman School of Public Health. We did that research with the Mailman School of Public Health at Columbia University in the early 90s. And every EJ community in the country can give you data like that about premature death and disease. So it's not that people don't understand what you're talking about, they just don't like what you're selling. And you're walking into a conversation that's steeped in people coming into communities and telling them, this facility is not going to have any adverse environmental impact. This facility is going to bring jobs. This facility is going to increase the local tax base. All of those narratives have been brought before, and not one of them has proven to be true. We've gotten all the negative externalities and hardly any of the benefits. So when you come into a space or you identify communities that you want to bring this technology to, just recognize that there's decades of conversation and lived experience that's already happened. And then you come, right? So it's not the message, it's not the messenger, it's the lived experience.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Vernice. Yeah. And I'm very grateful for that, taking all the notes. And so I want to build on that conversation. Ben, your work is in communications and working alongside organizations to engage in those two-way dialogue opportunities, right? And so given that, powerful perspective and thought that Vernice just added to this dialogue, what are some of the things that you would advise organizations around as they're thinking through or rethinking the ways to advance these communication opportunities?
Well, first I want to say, you don't need me. Let's just have Vernice talk for the next 45 minutes. I mean, wow. I want to actually just build on what she said, and hopefully I'll answer your question. And if I don't, you can just kick me under the table. I think part of this is about approach. So you just heard Vernice talk about message and messenger and those things, right? I think some of the problem and some of the things we need to do differently, back to the point that Nate made earlier, is the approach. We heard yesterday David Mansma from the Mitchell Foundation say that there's folks in Houston who are saying that no one has ever told them what these technologies are, right? And I think sometimes in the past, what we've done when we go into communities is we say, we're going to do this, blah, 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 and here's what and we jump into the middle of the conversation. And we assume that because we are whoever we are and whatever it is we're trying to do, and we're trying to do good, that everyone's going to sort of come along on that journey with us. And we assume we can jump into the middle of the conversation and not do any of the pre-work, and not do any of the hard work, and as one of the panelists said yesterday, the messy work of talking about what this is, why it's important, how it works, right? So if you've never talked about these carbon capture technologies, I'm a resident, right, as you just heard from Vernice. You're coming into my community, I've lived here my whole life, you're bringing some technology maybe I do or maybe I don't understand, and you're just sort of jumping into, here's what we're doing, here's why it works, and here's why you should care about it, but you didn't do any of the explanation. And you didn't do any of that kind of, let's have a conversation about who we are, what our involvement is in this community, what our commitment is to this community, where we're going to be now and forever, right? As opposed to coming in and then, oh, poof, we disappear. I'll give you an example. So in 2004, so think back 19 years, I led the media team. I was at a big PR firm, and I led the media team for the opening of the first publicly accessible hydrogen refueling station in North America. Really cool, right? Hydrogen, yay, power of the future, all of our cars are gonna run on hydrogen. So we were hired to sort of help do the event. We didn't do any pre-work, right? We hadn't spent 6 months in the community doing explanation. We were just hired to do this event. It was literally an event project. It was a couple months, and away we went. Well, guess what? It's 2004. Hydrogen is like, what? Right? It's beautiful. We have hydrogen cars, but I think there was one manufacturer, there was one model. They maybe sold 700 cars that year, right? It's a very small market. Well, in their infinite wisdom, they decided they were going to put this refueling station in Southeast DC, in Anacostia, right across the river from Capitol Hill. I think they did that because they thought, oh, we can get Congress to refuel vehicles, and it'll be close to Congress, it'll be great. What it looked like was, we'll put this in a poor, what we've said today, affected community, and it'll be good, right? It'll be good for jobs, et cetera. Well, guess what happened? We had protesters, because all folks knew about hydrogen was the Hindenburg, right?
I was not out there.
So we didn't do the pre-work. The client didn't do the pre-work. I don't think the station's still there. It was 19 years ago. I probably should have looked. But the point here is you can't just sort of parachute in, right? Some of this is about the approach you take. And I think the other thing we have to think about, hopefully this is getting to answer Nate's question. The other thing we have to think about is I think sometimes we tend to check a box, or we tend to sort of see, as I said yesterday in our conversation, see folks we're working with as the other, right? And we look down on them. We don't know that we're doing it, but that's literally what we're doing. And rather than thinking about looking next to the person and having this person be part of the conversation that I'm in, we look down on them. And the way that we carry ourselves, the way that we communicate is really about looking down. So I'll give you an example. We say affected communities. That's kind of off-putting, right? I mean, it almost sort of feels like that's the other. This is this special case we have to try to fix, right? We're the saviors that are going to come in and fix this. I don't live in an affected community, but I would imagine if I did, to Vernice's point, I might feel like, okay, who are you and why are you telling me about where I live, right? So I want to suggest that we think about maybe talking about engaged communities or involved communities or included communities rather than affected, as an example of how we think about approaching this from the perspective of I'm next to you and I'm going to be here part of the conversation as opposed to I'm looking down at you. So that's one thing to kind of think about.
Yeah, thank you for that.
Nate, can I say one thing?
Yeah, I'll throw in a question. Go ahead.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah. No, okay.
So I do think language has power.
Yeah.
So it can't fix everything, right? It can't fix someone parachuting in, like you talked about. But I will say that how we talk can either immediately alienate people, or it can, right? It can put up a barrier that all of a sudden people are having to leap over. I use an analogy. This is a true story. I love those award shows like the Oscars and the Golden Globes and all that stuff. So I'm watching the Golden Globes one year, many years ago. There was a very popular television show called Desperate Housewives.
I love that show.
Okay, so the guy who created Desperate Housewives, Mark Cherry, gets up to accept this award. It was the first year, and he says, you know, I'm so grateful. This show almost didn't get made. He's like, I pitched it to everyone. And if you go on Wikipedia and look up Desperate Housewives, literally like Lifetime TV turned them down. Everyone turned this poor guy down. And so finally some guy, and he's telling the story while he's accepting the award, he says, finally I went to so-and-so, and he says, well, pitch it to me like you're pitching it to them. And he says, okay, well, it's a satire about women in the suburbs. And the guy goes, whoa, stop. It's not a satire. It's a nighttime soap about women in the suburbs, blah, blah, blah. So he didn't change his script. He didn't change the science. He didn't change the policy, right? He didn't change anything about it. he just changed how he introduced this, and it went on to be like the #1 show on ABC, I think on television for like years, right? And it was one word, was like throwing everybody off. It's not that simple, right? That's not the only, I don't have a silver bullet to give you. But I do use that story to tell people that we're not trying to change the technology, we're not trying to change whatever. It's just, but we have to introduce it in a way to people who may not be familiar with it, in a way that immediately doesn't like put up the satire barrier, so that they won't listen to anything else we have to say. So I do think in my work, I found that language can have an impact in terms of how people receive new information.
Absolutely. Thank you all so much. Now, I mean, like, just in one question, I mean, I feel like I appreciate this centering, right, of community engagement. It means being very intentional and thoughtful about what we're saying and how we're saying it. It means being actually actively involved and not coming in for a week or two and then thinking that that's all that needs to happen. It's how do we actually build trust over a period of time. And Vernice, to the points you were making, it means trusting that communities know what they're talking about and they know their circumstances and they know their community better than any of us could, right? That's true for any of us in our neighborhoods, it's true for any of us with our families, and so just keeping that in mind, that we do not necessarily always know more than what folks know about what's happening in their own backyard.
Can I add one other thing?
Yeah.
I neglected to say this before. I think we have to remember that to get respect, you have to give respect. And I think sometimes we think we're doing that, and we're not. So it really is about taking a step back and thinking about everything that Vernice said, and then what the approach is as well. It's not just the language, it's also the approach and the perspective that you're coming at this from. And sometimes that requires turning it around and looking at it from, as Vernice said, the perspective of the other person. Sometimes that requires asking for help. Oh, shocking, right? and getting help and thinking about how to do this and taking some time, which is hard, right? I'm a startup and I'm trying to get this done and we have a limited amount of money. Oh, we gotta get this done, right? I don't have time to take time to think this through. Well, guess what? You're either gonna pay for it at the beginning or you're gonna pay for it at the end. I'd much rather pay for it in the beginning and do it the right way. We're learning that not doing that means you pay for it in the end. And sometimes you don't get your project through.
So we have exactly 20 minutes left, and so I want to give that time to you all to ensure that you get to include your voice in this dialogue as well. So I think we have one question already in the back. If there's anyone with a mic, go from there.
Hello, hi, good morning. This is Rudra Kapila from Third Way. My question is actually tying in some of the comments and discussion we had from yesterday regarding environmental justice, and also kind of, I know that the next panel is looking at engaging with DOE. So it's a comment and a question. The comment is the community benefit plans that are tied with projects do not necessarily mean community buy-in. So in terms of deployment, what do we do when communities are rejecting the technology and they don't want it? So how do we build and deploy that?
What a great question. And here is, I think, where the rubber really hits the road. This conversation is layered on top of a conversation that many communities have been having for a really long time with the state environmental agencies, local environmental agencies, and certainly US EPA about agency, about when does a community have the right to say that what happens where I live, right, has to be value added to my life and the life of the residents here, has to have environmental and ecological benefits. And if we determine that it doesn't have that, then if we say no, then we have the agency and the right to say no, period, end of story. Now, there's a demographic reality to that. Most middle-class white communities, if they were to say no to the technology or to any industrial facility siting, they usually get their way. and they go and find some other place. Our sewage treatment plant was supposed to be built on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. And the folks who lived on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, and this is in the 50s, mind you, were like, yeah, no, right? And lo and behold, they found another location on the Hudson River waterfront that happened to be where a majority Black and Latino community lived, right? They only moved it 3 miles, but those 3 miles was a world of difference. There was no formal process. Now, you know, people will go through a permitting process. They'll challenge the permit. They'll hire lawyers, et cetera, et cetera. But the demographics of who gets to have agency over where they live and what happens in their communities is vastly different in our country. Is there anybody that disagrees with that? Because I'll talk to you later. Because there's reams of data about this, right? But the other reality I want to give you in terms of messaging, language, sort of shifting the narrative and the conversation. So much of what we see this administration doing, particularly at the Department of Energy, is because of their long engagement with EJ communities and hiring people who are expert from those communities. Dr. Tony Reams has stood up a new office on energy justice. Did you ever think you would hear of DOE having an Office of Energy Justice? They hired Dr. Shalonda Baker from Northeastern University. Shalonda is the foremost thinker on environmental justice and energy and power resources. She now works at the Department of Energy, leading an extraordinary team of people. There is extraordinary work going on at DOE to advance environmental justice in the energy sector. They didn't just think of that overnight. You know, the president didn't go to sleep one day and wake up before he was sworn in and say, I think I'll work on these justice issues. And they're happening all across the administration in every branch of federal government. Why do you think that is? Because we've been doing the work. And that work means we did the research, we did the analysis, we did the comparative analysis, we worked with the regulators, we worked with EPA, we changed their thinking because the data was so stark. The data was so stark about who was getting benefits and who was getting burdens, and how do we equalize and really make equal protection under the law really happen. So I would just say that this conversation is happening. If we wanted to stuff it back in a bottle, we couldn't. The toothpaste is out of the tube. And so we have to figure out how do we merge into this conversation, right? And bring the benefits, and I'm gonna look a lot harder into the benefits, because if you can reduce fine particle pollution, I'm with that, right? Because fine particle pollution is killing Black and brown people in this country at extraordinary levels. If that can actually happen, then that's a really good thing, and you should be talking about that. And you should be talking about that in the places that are bearing a really heavy public health burden from that. But let's have an honest conversation, and let's have a conversation that's layered on top of what the lived experience and reality is of other folks. Another conversation to have, we could have it at another time, but the whole notion of cumulative impact. You enter into a conversation about cumulative impact that EPA is codifying at a legislative level, at a rulemaking level. The states are gonna have to come to grips with what does it mean when you have a community that has multiple sources of air pollution and other sources of contamination. What does it mean to regulate in that environment? That's a completely different approach. We've been asking EPA to do it for 30 years and we're finally there. Still trying to figure out the science, but maybe you can contribute to that. Maybe you can contribute to that. What does cumulative impact look like? And what could this technology add to understanding that, but also beginning to bring down emissions levels? So maybe enter into the conversation in a way that's helpful to a discourse that's already going on.
And I want to add just 2 thoughts to that. First, Nate said something in the introduction that really struck me because I don't think we've heard the term in the last 2 days, and that is environmental racism. Not environmental justice, environmental racism. So the comments that Vernice just made about where they put that facility in New York, right? I think, look, this may be tough, particularly for white people in the majority to acknowledge. Environmental racism is not a concern. It is not a, well, let's discuss it. It's a fact. And this is why we are dealing with so much of what we're dealing with. Because for decades, policy was racist. We've heard it, someone mentioned redlining yesterday, right? That's why we got into this pickle. Because we were not respecting other people. Because we were, oh, well, we'll put it over here, problem solved, right? So that's part of the acknowledgement. Yes, it's painful. Yes, it's hard. Yes, it feels like, oh, but let's acknowledge it as a fact and then figure out what to do about it. And to the question from Rudra, I think these are just small little tactical things to build on the excellent commentary that Vernice gave. But two things I would suggest. One, lose the acronyms. If I never hear the term CCS again, it'll be too soon, right? You're going into a community, you're going anywhere and you start using acronyms, it's like, hi, I'm from the government, I'm here to help you, you know? I mean, when I was on the Hill, my boss always said that. It was a big applause line, everyone giggled, right? Acronyms? No, tell me what this is. You know, to Laurie's point, carbon management. Oh, well, that sounds interesting. I'd like to know more, right? So that's the first thing. Second thing is, Shannon mentioned this morning, that it's not a silver bullet. Of course it isn't. But I think sometimes if we don't say that in those words, the assumption is that I'm advocating for this or I'm advocating for that. I am therefore saying, this is the silver bullet, and if you just follow me into the wilderness, I'm going to solve all your problems. I don't think anyone's really saying that, for the most part, but that's how it's perceived. So you have to make the point again and again and again, this is part of a greater whole, right? This is part of a whole suite of things we need to do, and GPI does this fairly well, but we all have to do that. We all have to talk about how carbon capture, carbon management, carbon storage, all these different things are part of a whole. We need to do them and a whole lot of other things. Doesn't mean we don't do anything. It doesn't mean we just do this. It does mean we have to understand the context. So that's a small tactical answer. I'm not sure I totally answered what Rudra wanted, but that's what
I was just about to say the same thing. Did we answer your question?
We talked a lot.
Hi. Is this on? Okay, it is. Thank you for this panel. This was really, really interesting and engaging. My question has to do with like communicating risk effectively and how you can go about that with like risk data, and also trying to take into consideration that there are like different perceptions of risk, there are different appetites for risk, and there are also like all of the lived experiences that people are like coming into this with. So do you have any like strategies for effectively communicating risk to communities?
Well, let's start with the professional communicator.
I'm not the professional. I think, well, numbers aren't going to make anyone feel more comfortable, right? It just doesn't. I will say too, and we had an intriguing conversation about gender last night over Tinder, but one thing I tend to see is that women are much more risk averse than are men. So for example, and I work on lots of different issues, but we've done like, you know, where do you put your kid in the car for airbag safety, or, you know, seat belts, all kinds of stuff like that. And we don't talk to dads ever. Because they're like, we never wore helmets. We were thrown in the back of a pickup truck, right? It's literally like, it's an entirely different conversation. So I think you need to be cognizant. We see this on like nuclear energy, for example. Women much more likely to say danger, safety, Chernobyl, like that's their top of mind association with nuclear energy, where men are like efficient, effective, like eventually they get to like Chernobyl or something. But, so there's a big gender distinction. I think that there is a big tension in terms of risk, because honestly, if we all looked at every statistic for pedestrian safety and the chances of this happening, nobody would ever get out of bed. So we're willing to accept some risk, but when it is a new introduced risk is when people, why would I introduce a new risk into my life, right? That just makes no sense. So it has to be balanced out with the, I hate to say co-benefits, but the benefits. If I'm reducing risks for something else, like air pollution or whatever that might be, okay, right? But it's like they're weighing everything on a scale.
And different communities have different risk profiles. I so resonate with that. If you look across the landscape of the environmental justice movement, in fact, there's a wonderful exhibit at the Smithsonian Anacostia Community Museum in the Anacostia community right now called To Live and Breathe, Women and the Environmental Justice Movement, just about the different campaigns that women have led successfully and how they've shaped this movement. It's because women perceive what's happening in a community at a public health level differently than men do. I don't know why that is. It might be because we spend more time, per se, in the community. We're interacting with kids, we're interacting with those kids' parents, we're interacting with a whole different landscape of what is happening in a particular community, and you begin to notice that, this person has cancer, that person has cancer, that household has cancer, this person has chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. 7 of my kids' playmates are asthmatic. And you begin to recognize that this is not the community that I grew up in. Although it might be physically the same place, something different is happening. And you notice that. And then you figure out, we need to figure out what to do. We need to call people together. We need to invite people in. But the risk profiles of communities are different. So you need to know what that risk profile is. And then what Lori just said is so incredibly important. If there's already a perceived level of risk, and it's not imaginary, it's real, and all the data, EPA's own data finally verifies that, lots of independent data as well, but if you know that you already are experiencing environmental threats, and then someone comes in and says, I want to add yet another thing, even though the thing might have value, even though the thing might correct what the environmental problem is, it's really hard to hear that, right? And it's particularly really hard to hear when folks say, well, this would be a great project to have where you live. Not where I live, but where you live, this would be really great. Why don't you join me, right? Yeah, no. People are so over that because it's happened so many times. And that's why I say you need to know the context in which you're entering into these conversations. And by all means, be transparent. Share the data, right? I do a lot of training for EPA. I do a lot of work for US EPA. They used to be my biggest client when I worked at another firm. And we did some work with them around a project they were doing to work with ports to reduce the ambient air emissions from port operations for nearby communities, which are often EJ communities. And we're working in Savannah, at the port of Savannah. And EPA had done a lot of work, as had the port, to reduce ambient air pollution over years. But they never reported back to the community what they had done, ever. They never told the community, and apparently the reductions were astronomical, but they never told anybody that. So people are still operating with dated information. People went through that information with fine-tooth combs. They took those reports from EPA and they went through them with fine-tooth combs, and they're like, I'll be damned. The emissions levels have really gone down significantly, and the data shows it. People want to see cold, hard data. So have a conversation about data. Don't be afraid to put on the table, these are the existing conditions, this is what we're coming in to do, this is what we anticipate the reductions will be. Have those conversations, because those conversations will give people things they can work with.
And I would just add to that quickly, totally agree with everything that Lori and Vernice just said. The other challenge I think here is that we are often, particularly when we're dealing with this question in particular, we're afraid to get real. And we kind of dance around, well, and we sort of mumble, right? As opposed to saying, here's the problem, here is what this technology is designed to do, and to the point that Vernice just made, it's actually supposed to be helping, right? It's supposed to be directly addressing the problem that you are having. Yet we don't necessarily make that connection, and because we've never had a conversation about this, and as a community, we're sort of jumping in the middle as opposed to going back to the beginning and saying, let's have a national conversation about what this means. Because that's where we are now, folks are like, run that by me again? So I think we have to pretend, depending on what the technology is, whether you're talking about direct air capture or carbon capture or storage or transport or a pipeline, whatever it is, think about what the actual benefit is, what the perceived benefit is, and what the reality, where the delta of the reality is for that, and think about how to talk about that in a really direct way, and then back that up over time, so that you are directly addressing what people care about, and you're engaging with them, and letting them ask questions. And this is not a one-way street. It's supposed to be two-way, and it should be over time.
Great question.
We have Appreciate y'all. We have time for we have 3 minutes, so we got time for one more quick question. Yes, in the back.
Yeah, this is on. Okay, great. My name is Jess Oglesby. I work in communications at the Global CCS Institute. Looks like the lights are really bright up there, but I'm in the back.
We can make you out.
Raise your hand. Oh, there you are. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you for this panel. Really important topic, something we think about a lot, but needs to be a part of every conference. But my question is actually for Lori, but kind of picks up on something Vernice just said about the importance of context when we're thinking about messaging, thinking about working with communities. I was wondering if in your research at all, you mentioned on one of the slides, how different messages resonate with women versus men in different age groups, but did you look at race at all and how different messages resonated or not across different racial groups?
Yeah, and we certainly have not been in every single community. So there's, there can be, as we've already talked about, lots of nuance and, recognizing the problems that have existed in those communities. I will say this, that the thing that surprised us in Louisiana, I will say, is just because they had trust broken so many times that they were actually open to someone that was going to address some of the problem, right? And it was not immediately like, nope, I'm shutting that down. It was because there was already a recognized air pollution problem. That doesn't always happen in every community. I've been in places talking about like transportation and other issues where sometimes we can have, Black and brown communities that are not as aware of air pollution, and honestly, white communities that are not as aware of air pollution problems because it's not visible. Louisiana, there was a smell, right?
Everywhere.
Yeah. So when you have a smell, they're like, oh, and it just came up organically right at the beginning of the conversations. So there can be real distinctions in terms of awareness that there is a problem. I will say I've done work like in Chicago, for example, related, and I've done work around ports too, but where there wasn't an overwhelming awareness that, oh, there's a coal-burning power plant down the road. Oh, that's what that is? I didn't know what they were doing there, right? So awareness can be separated from some of the so I mean, literally, you have to like go into the community, listen to people. What's the catalyst in that specific community? And that really, honestly, it doesn't matter if that's a Black and brown community or if that's a white community. That listening, understanding what their concerns are, that has to take place in any community first. I don't know. Vernice?
100%.
Yeah? Okay.
100%.
Yeah. Thank you all. Please give them the biggest round of applause. I hope we walk away from this, with the perspective that communities are not at all powerless; they are powerful. And as Vernice mentioned earlier, or alluded to, we are only here in this moment with these resources and opportunities because of the work that community organizers and activists and engagement folks have done over the last several decades to get us to a point where this was a political reality, to have the opportunity to do this work and move it forward. So let's approach this work with communities with the respect that it requires, and gratitude for the work the communities have done to get us here. So thank you all so much for being here. And we will be back from break. We're shifting it up a little bit at 10:30 so that our panelists for our final panel are able to make a flight home. So thank you all so much.